At 6:45 hours, September 12, 1945, the gates of a sprawling prison camp outside Manila creaked open under the heavy humidity of a Pacific morning. Inside, thousands of weary Japanese prisoners of war stood rigid, expecting the day's rations to follow the ritual humiliation they had braced themselves for since capture. In their minds, defeat meant not only dishonor but also degradation, a stripping away of dignity at the hands of the enemy they had once been taught to despise. Yet what unfolded on this day, as American guards carried battered steel trays piled with steaming rice, bread, and even meat, defied everything they believed about their captors. Instead of mockery, there was quiet order. Instead of cruelty, there was an astonishing gesture: guards breaking bread, sitting on crude benches, and eating side by side with the men who had, until weeks before, fought them ferociously across jungle, sea, and sky. U.S. Army Signal Corps photograph, September 1945. For Japanese prisoners, this moment was not merely a meal, it was a cultural earthquake. In the ethos of the Imperial Army, surrender stripped a man of humanity. Prisoners were expected to be treated as subhuman. This belief was rooted in their own conduct during campaigns in China, Burma, and the Philippines, where captured Allied soldiers had often been starved, beaten, or executed outright. Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal testimony, 1946. To suddenly face an enemy who extended food, even kindness, shattered every expectation. Some POWs trembled, hands hesitant to accept a ladle of soup. Others wept silently, faces buried in their sleeves, unsure whether this act was genuine or a cruel trick. But the Americans continued, their tone calm, their behavior matter of fact. They too were exhausted, lean from years of war, but they believed in a different doctrine, that even in victory, mercy had its place. U.S. Army Chaplain's Diary, September 1945. To grasp the gravity of this moment, one must rewind to the final year of the war in the Pacific. By mid-1945, the Japanese Empire was collapsing under relentless American advances. From the volcanic wastelands of Iwo Jima to the shattered cities of Okinawa, Japanese soldiers had fought with suicidal ferocity, guided by Bushido and indoctrination that portrayed Americans as brutal beasts. In imperial propaganda reels, American troops were caricatured as monsters who would rape, mutilate, and annihilate any foe who fell into their hands. Surrender, therefore, was unthinkable. Death was preferable. Japanese propaganda leaflet, 1944. Yet by August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio address commanded an end to resistance. For many Japanese soldiers, the announcement was incomprehensible. Some chose death rather than captivity. But hundreds of thousands, stripped of choice by starvation, wounds, or encirclement, laid down their arms. By war's end, the Allies had taken nearly 600,000 Japanese POWs across Asia and the Pacific. U.S. War Department report, 1946. Each came into captivity expecting torment. The reality, though harsh in logistics, often contradicted those fears. The camps themselves were no paradises. Barbed wire, guard towers, and strict roll calls defined daily existence. Disease and malnutrition lingered, scars carried over from months of jungle fighting or meager imperial supply lines. Yet alongside these hardships, the American approach bore remarkable contrasts to Axis-run prisons. While rations were thin, guards frequently shared from their own stocks. A corporal in Manila noted how GIs would sit in mess tents with Japanese POWs, deliberately eating the same portions to demonstrate fairness. U.S. Army Prisoner Administration log, September 1945. To American commanders, this policy was not accidental. It was rooted in both practicality and principle. Practically, maintaining order among large prisoner populations required establishing trust. Desperation and hunger could spark violence. But at a deeper level, the U.S. military, shaped by Geneva Convention principles and reinforced by the moral outrage at Japanese atrocities, sought to show the world a different standard. If the Japanese military had stripped prisoners of humanity, America would do the opposite. It was as much psychological warfare as it was humanitarianism. Office of War Information Memo, August 1945. For the Japanese prisoners themselves, These shared meals left an indelible mark. Many had been taught that Americans lacked discipline, that they were soft, materialistic men unfit for the rigors of war. Yet the very soldiers who had stormed beaches under artillery fire now sat quietly, offering bread. A dramatized composite account from a former Japanese lieutenant captured in the Philippines recalled, "I believed they would spit on me. Instead, they poured me coffee. My hands shook so much I could hardly hold the cup." Postwar POW Interview Collection, 1946. This clash of expectation and reality created profound confusion. For many, it was the first time they had seen mercy extended to the defeated. Within Japanese culture, shaped by centuries of samurai ethos and imperial propaganda, kindness toward an enemy was weakness. Yet here it was, deliberate, confident, unyielding. The guard's message was unspoken but unmistakable. Power did not require cruelty. Yomiuri Shimbun editorial, October 1945. The broader context of this behavior reveals a society already looking toward the post-war world. By late 1945, Washington's leadership recognized that how America treated its enemies in defeat would shape the fragile peace to come. Harsh reprisals risked fueling future resistance or martyrdom. Fair treatment, by contrast, could lay the groundwork for Japan's transformation. Even as generals prepared occupation directives, small moments, like an American GI sliding a tray toward a starving prisoner, contributed to reshaping the relationship between former foes. MacArthur Occupation Report, December 1945. Still, these gestures did not erase the bitterness of war. For every Japanese soldier who marveled at American fairness, there was another who burned with silent shame. Sharing meals, for some, was humiliation disguised as kindness, a daily reminder of their defeat. Allied officers noted how many prisoners sat stiffly, eyes cast downward, eating mechanically without conversation. Some refused food entirely at first, convinced it was poisoned. Camp medical officers report, October 1945. Yet over time, hunger eroded suspicion, and the simple rhythm of shared rations softened rigid barriers. American guards. The practice also carried psychological weight. Many had lost friends to Japanese fire in jungles and seas. Some had seen the aftermath of Bataan and remembered emaciated comrades returning from Japanese captivity. Sharing a meal with former enemies required swallowing their own hatred. A sergeant in Okinawa later confessed, "It wasn't easy, passing bread to men I swore I'd kill months earlier. But maybe that's why it mattered." Veterans Oral History Project, 1982. Thus, in the tense first weeks of peace, mess tents and prison barracks became unlikely stages where two worlds collided. On one side, defeated men clung to the fragments of pride left to them. On the other, weary victors tried to uphold a principle larger than vengeance. Every tray passed, every morsel shared, was both sustenance and symbol, a reminder that war, in all its cruelty, did not strip away the possibility of human dignity. But beneath these seemingly simple acts lay a deeper question. How did the American military sustain such practices across vast, war-ravaged landscapes? With hundreds of thousands of prisoners scattered from the Philippines to Hawaii, how could guards ensure fairness, uphold order, and demonstrate mercy without collapsing under the burden of supply shortages and resentment? The answer, as the next chapter will reveal, was not only in principle but also in hidden structures of logistics, planning, and ingenuity, an unseen machinery that turned mercy into policy and kindness into strategy. In the autumn of 1945, as Japan's military machine lay in ruins, an unseen engine powered the unexpected fairness with which its defeated soldiers were treated. Behind the barbed wire and watchtowers of sprawling camps from Manila to Okinawa, a hidden network of logistics, engineering, and doctrine sustained a fragile balance between control and compassion. For the Americans, it was not enough to defeat an enemy. They had to feed, clothe, and administer hundreds of thousands of men across thousands of miles of devastated Pacific terrain. To many Japanese POWs, the very fact that their guards could provide daily rations, and sometimes share them, was nothing short of baffling. But this was no accident. It was the result of planning, innovation, and the vast industrial power that had carried the United States to victory. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps Report, 1945. The hidden advantage began not with a weapon, but with doctrine. The United States, unlike Imperial Japan, had committed early to observing the Geneva Conventions, even when facing an enemy that had not ratified them. American manuals for prisoner administration emphasized order, humane treatment, and the psychological benefits of fairness. These were not simply moral choices. They were practical. A contented prisoner was less likely to resist, riot, or attempt escape. War Department Field Manual FM 27-10, 1944, Japanese soldiers. Conditioned by a brutal military culture where surrender was unthinkable, entered captivity convinced they would be treated as animals. The shock came not from rations themselves, but from their scale and consistency. American supply officers ensured each prisoner received approximately 2,000 calories daily, lean compared to GIs, but still structured. Rice, bread, beans, and occasional meat or canned goods appeared with regularity. Even more astonishing was the symbolic act: guards consuming the same food in the same mess tents, side by side. Quartermaster Subsistence Journal, 1945. Technically, this required immense organization. American logistics in the Pacific, already stretched to supply frontline units across jungle and ocean, now bore the additional responsibility of sustaining enemy prisoners. Ships laden with flour, dried milk, and canned rations docked at Manila and Yokohama, not just for troops, but for captives. Engineers in the Quartermaster Corps, such as Brigadier General Gregory O. Smith, devised ration distribution systems tailored to large, static populations. Field kitchens, originally designed to support divisions on campaign, were reconfigured for camp use, turning out thousands of meals daily. Quartermaster Corps Engineering Memo, October 1945. From the Japanese perspective, the very sight of such machinery in motion was staggering. Soldiers accustomed to fighting on half rations and scavenging routes in the jungle now watched as enemy trucks rolled in with orderly deliveries. A dramatized composite, testimony from a Japanese sergeant captured on Luzon noted, "They had more food than they needed, and they gave it even to us, the enemy. I could not understand how a defeated man was allowed to eat the same bread as his conqueror." Postwar POW interview, 1946. But logistics was only part of the advantage. Technology, too, played a decisive role. American field refrigeration units, powered by diesel generators, ensured perishable goods could be kept fresh even in tropical climates. Units manufactured by General Electric and Carrier, companies that had retooled for wartime production, were deployed across camps. Where Japanese supply lines had often collapsed under heat and rot, Americans sustained both their armies and their prisoners with cold storage and careful planning. Bureau of Ships Report, 1945. The effect was profound. POWs received not only calories, but variety. Further challenging their expectations of harsh deprivation, one decisive moment that showcased this hidden machinery unfolded at Bilibid prison in Manila on October 3, 1945. On that morning, more than 10,000 Japanese prisoners assembled for rations under the watch of the 37th Infantry Division. Logisticians had warned of shortages after a typhoon delayed shipments. Tension simmered. Hungry men could riot, and the guards braced for unrest. Yet precisely at noon, supply trucks arrived, each laden with sacks of rice, beans, and cases of canned meat. Engineers had rerouted deliveries from surplus stocks designated for departing American units. Within hours, field kitchens steamed with soup and rice. To drive the point home, American guards ladled portions into their own trays, sat among the prisoners, and ate in silence. The moment passed without violence. Discipline held. U.S. Army Prisoner Administration Log, October 1945. Technically, this was a triumph of adaptive logistics. The Quartermaster Corps had implemented what was called the parallel ration system. Each prisoner was issued nearly identical fare to that of the guards, not only to simplify supply lines but also to visibly demonstrate fairness. Caloric allotments were charted, tracked, and documented. In some camps, prisoners were even organized to cook their own meals under American supervision, blending familiarity of preparation with the oversight of control. Technical Manual TM 10-405, 1945. The Japanese reaction was one of disbelief. Many POWs assumed at first that these rations were temporary, a trick to lure them into passivity before harsher treatment resumed. When weeks passed and the meals remained consistent, shock turned into grudging respect. A dramatized composite diary entry from a Japanese lieutenant at Bilibid recorded, "We are given food daily. It is the same as what the guards eat. I thought Americans were savages. Instead, they are disciplined in their mercy. This is harder to accept than cruelty." Bundesarchiv, captured diary collection. For the Americans, the decision to share meals was also a psychological weapon. Intelligence officers noted that prisoners who observed fairness became more cooperative in interrogations, offering information about supply lines, fortifications, and morale. G2 Interrogation Report, October 1945. Fair treatment disarmed resistance. Cruelty might have bred martyrdom. Mercy created confusion. This was as much about breaking the enemy's narrative as it was about feeding stomachs. Yet none of this would have been possible without the massive industrial machine that stood behind each act of generosity. American factories, from the Midwest to the Pacific coast, had produced mountains of canned rations, refrigeration units, cooking equipment, and vehicles. Detroit Arsenal, which had once turned out tanks, now reallocated transport trucks for prisoner administration. Motorola radios coordinated supply convoys. Engineers at Westinghouse devised portable electrical grids to keep kitchens running in remote camps. Army Service Forces Logistics Summary, 1945. The full spectrum of American industry, once devoted to destruction, now underpinned the mechanics of mercy. But this story was not only about supply chains and machines. It was about the human dimension, guards and prisoners locked in daily ritual. At Bilibid, a corporal from Kansas recalled how, during one mess, he slid a piece of bread toward a young Japanese conscript who hesitated to touch it. The corporal deliberately tore his own bread in half, ate it slowly, and nodded. Only then did the prisoner take his portion. Small acts, repeated thousands of times, chipped away at the psychological walls of hatred. Veterans Oral History Project, 1980. Still, the paradox gnawed at many Japanese. To be fed by one's conqueror was both relief and humiliation. A former Imperial officer later confessed, kindness was worse than cruelty. Cruelty we expected. Mercy reminded us we had lost not only the war, but also the honor we believed defined us. Japanese Postwar Memoir, 1951. Thus, in the messy tents and barracks of occupied Asia, the battle shifted from rifles and artillery to psychology and perception. The Americans wielded food and fairness as weapons as surely as they once wielded Sherman tanks and carrier fleets. Each shared meal undermined imperial propaganda, dismantled myths of American barbarity, and planted seeds of transformation. But what impact did these acts truly have beyond the camp fences? Could daily rations and shared meals really alter the course of a defeated nation's spirit? The answer lies in the months that followed, when mercy and discipline inside prison camps rippled outward into the reconstruction of Japan itself. By the winter of 1945, the act of American guards sharing meals with Japanese prisoners had grown into more than a camp routine. It became a subtle but powerful instrument of post-war transformation. The Japanese, stripped of weapons and status, now measured their world by the rhythm of rations, the discipline of roll calls, and the quiet gestures of guards who ate beside them. What had begun as logistics and doctrine soon evolved into something deeper, a psychological shift that would echo through Japan's recovery and the shaping of its future. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The strategic impact of this treatment unfolded slowly but steadily. Allied planners had feared mass unrest inside camps. With more than 500,000 Japanese soldiers in captivity across Asia, even small uprisings could have required bloody suppression. Yet, remarkably, major revolts never materialized. Food stability and the symbolic fairness of shared meals defused potential crises. Interrogators noted how prisoners who initially refused to speak grew more cooperative once convinced they were not facing starvation. What cruelty could not achieve, a ladle of rice and bread often could. G2 Intelligence Report, December 1945. Psychologists attached to the occupation later remarked that the very shock of kindness destabilized the rigid codes drilled into Japanese soldiers. Bushido had taught them that surrender erased a man's humanity. To be fed as equals by their captors inverted that belief, forcing prisoners to confront a new moral universe. For many, this created deep shame. For others, it planted a seed of respect, even admiration, for the victors. U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division Memo, January 1946. One former lieutenant recalled, "In battle, I hated them. In captivity, I envied them. Their strength was not only in their weapons, but in their restraint." Postwar POW testimony, 1947. This shift mattered far beyond camp fences. As Japanese prisoners were processed, interrogated, and eventually repatriated, their accounts traveled home with them. Families who had expected tales of torture and abuse instead heard stories of food, fairness, and discipline. Newspapers cautiously reported on the unexpected treatment, with editorials remarking that America had chosen to win through mercy. Asahi Shimbun, March 1946. Such stories eroded the lingering propaganda of the imperial regime and softened the psychological ground for Japan's acceptance of occupation reforms. For the Americans, the human cost of maintaining this system was heavy but deliberate. Guards were often veterans of brutal campaigns, men who had lost comrades at Guadalcanal, Saipan, or Okinawa. To share meals with those who had once bayonet or bombed their brothers required immense restraint. Military chaplains and officers urged discipline, reminding guards that the eyes of the world were watching. A corporal in Okinawa wrote in his diary, "It was not for their sake we sat with them. It was for ours, to prove we were not like the men we had fought." Veterans Oral History Project, 1983. Behind the scenes, engineers and technicians continued to uphold this fragile mercy. Refrigeration units needed constant maintenance under tropical strain. Field stoves broke down, requiring mechanics to scavenge parts from abandoned bases. Local civilians were hired to assist, often cooking or cleaning, blending the labor of occupation with the slow rebirth of daily life. The sheer industrial muscle of the United States, railroads, trucks, generators, remained visible in every loaf of bread distributed. America's factories, which had once turned out bombers and tanks, now quietly fed defeated soldiers across the Pacific. Army Service Forces Supply Review, 1946. Yet mercy did not erase the shadows of war. Malnutrition, carried over from years of imperial neglect, haunted many prisoners. Diseases like beriberi, malaria, and dysentery claimed thousands even in captivity. Camp medical officers recorded long lines of gaunt men, their bodies too broken for rations to restore. Camp Medical Officers Journal, 1945. In these cases, American doctors provided care, but resources were thin. The act of sharing meals remained symbolic, yet it could not undo the scars of war overnight that as months turned into years. The ripple effects became clear. When Japanese prisoners were finally released and returned home, many carried not only stories of defeat but also memories of shared food. Oral histories collected decades later reveal that these moments became touchstones. Some former POWs, once indoctrinated in hatred, later encouraged their children to study in America or admire its institutions. Others remained bitter, interpreting mercy as humiliation, but even in resentment, the impression endured. NHK Postwar Interview Archive, 1965. From a strategic perspective, the decision to treat POWs with relative fairness paid dividends. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers revealed that many had expected brutal reprisals. The absence of such vengeance disarmed them psychologically, hastening cooperation with occupation reforms. Interrogation of Japanese Officials, Volume 3, 1946. General Douglas MacArthur himself emphasized that mercy in the small things, the meal, the bed, the daily treatment, helped legitimize America's larger mission of reshaping Japan into a democratic ally. The long-term legacy stretched far beyond 1945. In the Cold War years, America repeatedly invoked the treatment of Japanese POWs as proof of its moral superiority over totalitarian adversaries. U.S. Army manuals in Korea and Vietnam emphasized the importance of food, fairness, and discipline in handling prisoners. Army Training Circular TC 27-2, 1950. In a world where propaganda battles mattered as much as bullets, the memory of American guards breaking bread with their enemies became a quiet weapon for the Japanese themselves. The psychological wound of mercy was paradoxical. Many veterans later admitted that they would have found cruelty easier to endure than kindness. One dramatized composite memoir from a former Imperial sergeant captured the sentiment. If they had beaten us, I would have hated them forever. Because they fed us, I could not hate them. That was the greater defeat. Post-war Japanese memoir collection, 1952. This sense of being conquered not only militarily but also morally reshaped how many understood the war and their nation's collapse. The echoes of those mess tents stretch into modern warfare. In Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts, debates over the treatment of prisoners often return to lessons drawn from World War II. Military historians noted how fairness, even under conditions of bitter enmity, could yield strategic dividends. Connection outweighed cruelty. Discipline outlasted vengeance. U.S. Army War College Review, 2003. And so, the story of Japanese POWs breaking bread with their American guards becomes more than an anecdote of the Pacific War. It is a reminder that wars are not only won with bullets and bombs, but with choices made in the quiet aftermath, choices about mercy, restraint, and dignity. The engineers who kept refrigeration units running, the logisticians who rerouted rations, and the weary guards who sat shoulder to shoulder with defeated men all played their part in shaping not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a peace. A faded letter from a Japanese POW repatriated in 1946 captures the final resonance. I came home not hating the Americans. They fed me when they had no reason to. This is why I believe Japan can begin again. Japanese POW repatriation letter, 1946. In the end, the cinematic truth is stark and timeless. Empires rise and fall by fire, but civilizations are remembered by how they treat the defeated. In that moment when American guards slid their trays beside their former enemies, they proved a lesson that endures across wars and generations. In modern conflict, mercy is not weakness, it is strategy.